Hashtag the history of public education in America. Hashtag BrainBoost Academy. Full narration script. Imagine a country where your ability to read, write, and think critically depended entirely on how wealthy your parents were. Where knowledge was a luxury item, available only to those who could afford private tutors or expensive schooling. That was America for much of its early history. The story of how the United States built one of the world's largest public education systems, serving over 50 million students today, is a story of revolution, resistance, idealism, and slow, grinding progress. And it is a story that is still unfolding. Let's go back to the very beginning. Hashtag the colonial era. Education as privilege. When European settlers arrived on American shores in the 1600s, formal education was almost exclusively the domain of the wealthy and the religious. The Puritans of New England, however, held a surprisingly progressive belief that every person needed to read the Bible for themselves. This religious conviction accidentally planted the seed for universal literacy. In 1647, the Massachusetts Bay Colony passed what historians call the Old Deluder-Satan Act. This law required every town with 50 or more families to establish a reading and writing school. Towns with 100 or more families had to provide a grammar school capable of preparing young men for university. This was the first government mandate for education in American history. But let's be honest about what this system looked like. Schools were one-room buildings with dirt floors. Teachers were often barely educated themselves. Girls were frequently excluded from formal instruction. Native American children and enslaved black children were systematically denied access to any education whatsoever. The system that existed served a very narrow slice of the population, and it was entirely inconsistent from colony to colony, town to town. Hashtag the founding era. Education meets democracy. When the American Revolution succeeded and the new nation began to take shape, the founding generation grappled with a profound question: can democracy survive without an educated citizenry? Thomas Jefferson believed the answer was absolutely not. He proposed a bill in Virginia in 1779 that would provide 3 years of free public schooling to all white children. The Virginia legislature rejected it, but the idea took root. Jefferson famously wrote that an educated populace was the guardian of liberty. His vision saw public schools not as charity for the poor, but as an investment in the democratic republic itself. The Northwest Ordinance of 1787 made a landmark declaration, stating that schools and the means of education shall forever be encouraged. This law set aside public land in the new territories specifically for the funding of schools. It was the first federal recognition that education had a public interest, that it was not simply a private family matter. Yet enforcement was weak, funding was scarce, and the reality on the ground remained deeply unequal. Most American children, particularly in the South and in rural areas, received little to no formal schooling through the late 1700s and into the early 1800s. Hashtag Horace Mann and the Common School movement. The true turning point came in the 1830s and 1840s, driven by one extraordinary man, Horace Mann. Appointed Secretary of the Massachusetts Board of Education in 1837, Mann became the most influential education reformer in American history. He believed passionately that free, universal, non-sectarian public schooling was the great equalizer of human condition, the balance wheel of the social machinery, as he called it. Mann traveled to Prussia and brought back a revolutionary model. He advocated for trained, professional teachers, graded classrooms organized by age, longer school years, and a standardized curriculum. He fought to increase teacher salaries and establish the first teacher training institutions, called normal schools, in the United States. His 12 annual reports to the Massachusetts legislature laid out a comprehensive vision that influenced education policy across the entire nation. By the 1850s, most northern states had established free common schools funded by property taxes, with compulsory attendance laws beginning to appear on the horizon. Hashtag the Civil War and Reconstruction. Education as liberation. The Civil War fundamentally transformed what public education meant in America. For enslaved Black Americans, education had been deliberately and brutally suppressed. In many southern states, it was literally illegal to teach an enslaved person to read. When freedom came, formerly enslaved people pursued education with extraordinary hunger and determination. Freedmen's Bureau schools opened across the South after 1865, often taught by Northern volunteers and black teachers who had educated themselves in secret. In just a few years, hundreds of thousands of black Americans learned to read and write. The Reconstruction era produced Southern states' first public school systems. These were biracial institutions established under Reconstruction governments, and they represented something genuinely radical for their time. However, when Reconstruction ended in 1877 and white supremacist governments returned to power across the South, these schools were systematically defunded, segregated, and degraded. The promise of equal education was deferred for nearly another century. #The Progressive Era, Compulsion, Expansion, and Reform. Between 1880 and 1920, American public education expanded at a breathtaking rate. Immigration was transforming the country. Millions of people arrived from Southern and Eastern Europe, speaking dozens of different languages. Public schools became the primary institution for Americanization, teaching English, civics, and shared cultural values. By 1900, 31 states had compulsory attendance laws. By 1918, every single state in the Union required children to attend school. Philosopher and educator John Dewey emerged as the dominant thinker of this period. Dewey challenged the rigid, rote memorization model inherited from the 19th century. He argued that education should develop critical thinking, problem-solving, and democratic participation, not simply produce obedient workers who could recite facts. His progressive education philosophy influenced curriculum design for decades, emphasizing hands-on learning, student interest, and real-world application. High school enrollment exploded during this period as well. In 1890, only about 200,000 students attended high school in America. By 1940, that number exceeded 7 million. #The Civil Rights Era, the battle for equal schools. By the mid-20th century, American public schools were still deeply segregated. The Supreme Court's 1896 Plessy v. Ferguson decision had established the separate but equal doctrine, which in practice meant separate and profoundly unequal. Black schools received dramatically less funding, older textbooks, inferior facilities, and lower teacher salaries. This was not an accident, it was policy. On May 17, 1954, the Supreme Court issued its unanimous ruling in Brown v. Board of Education, declaring that racially segregated schools were inherently unequal and unconstitutional. Chief Justice Earl Warren wrote that separating children solely on the basis of race generates a feeling of inferiority that may affect their hearts and minds in ways unlikely to ever be undone. The ruling was historic. The implementation was agonizing. Massive resistance erupted across the South. Federal troops escorted black students into schools. Governors stood in doorways. Communities closed entire school systems rather than integrate them. Full implementation stretched across decades of continued struggle, legal battles, and social activism. #The Modern Era, Federal Involvement and Accountability. The federal government's role in public education grew significantly through the latter half of the 20th century. The Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965, passed as part of Lyndon Johnson's Great Society programs, sent billions of federal dollars into schools serving low-income students. It was the largest federal investment in K-12 education in American history up to that point, and it established the principle that the federal government had a responsibility to address educational inequality. The 1975 Individuals with Disabilities Education Act guaranteed students with disabilities the right to a free and appropriate public education, another landmark expansion of who public schools were obligated to serve. Then in 2001, the No Child Left Behind Act brought a new era of standardized testing and school accountability, requiring schools to demonstrate measurable progress or face consequences. Supporters argued it shone a light on achievement gaps that schools had been allowed to ignore. Critics argued it reduced education to test preparation and punished already struggling schools. The debate over how to measure school quality and hold schools accountable continues vigorously today. The ongoing story. American public education in the 21st century faces challenges that would have been unimaginable to Horace Mann.